There's a man in his late 30s standing in a parking lot, staring at a car he cannot afford. He is not window shopping. He is not admiring engineering. He is standing completely still, phone already open to a financing calculator, doing math that will never work out in his favor. The car is a 1994 Toyota Supra. He has wanted it since he was 9 years old. He does not fully understand why. This happens more than people realize. Millennials, the generation born between 1981 and 1996, are now in their peak earning years, and a significant portion of them are spending that money not on sensible family vehicles, but on the exact cars they obsessed over during childhood. Used market prices for 90s sports cars have tripled in under a decade. The Mazda RX-7, the Acura NSX, the Mitsubishi Eclipse. These are not rare collectibles reclaimed by wealthy baby boomers. They are being hunted down by people who grew up watching them on television, playing them in video games, and taping pictures of them to bedroom walls. The question is not whether this is happening. The question is what planted that obsession so deeply that 30 years could not erase it. To understand it, you have to go back to the 1990s, not as a decade of pop culture nostalgia, but as a specific psychological environment for children. The Cold War had just ended. The economy was expanding. Technology was accelerating in ways that felt genuinely exciting rather than overwhelming. And the car, for the first time in history, was being presented to young audiences not just as transportation, but as a character, as a personality, as a dream worth having. Television did something specific during this period. Shows built entire identities around vehicles. Knight Rider had already spent the 1980s convincing a generation that a car could be a companion. By the early 90s, that idea had evolved. Cars were no longer just cool, they were aspirational extensions of the self. The vehicles in these stories were not background props, they were the point. Children absorbed this framing at an age when the brain is most vulnerable to emotional imprinting. Developmental psychologists refer to the period between ages 8 and 14 as a critical window for identity formation. Whatever captures attention and produces strong emotion during this window tends to stay embedded for life. Then, video games changed everything. Before the mid-90s, most children had never sat in the driver's seat of a powerful car and felt what it could do. In 1994, Gran Turismo was still 3 years away. But arcade racing games were already putting children behind the wheel of vehicles they would never otherwise touch. By 1997, Gran Turismo arrived on the PlayStation and did something no medium had done before. It gave children a garage. Not just a race, a garage. A place to own cars, modify them, upgrade them, and form something resembling a relationship with them. The Supra was in that garage. The NSX was in that garage. The game presented these cars with a reverence that felt almost documentary. Specifications listed in careful detail. Engine sounds recorded from real vehicles. For millions of children, this was their first extended emotional experience of automotive desire, and it was entirely simulated. This is the part most people misunderstand. They assume the nostalgia is about the car. It is not. It is about the feeling the car represented during a specific and unrepeatable moment in time. Research in affective neuroscience shows that memories formed during periods of high emotion and novelty become disproportionately durable. The brain does not store them as ordinary memories. It stores them as reference points, moments the nervous system returns to when trying to calculate what joy, excitement, or freedom feel like. For millennials, many of those reference points were built inside a video game, or during a Friday night watching a film, or on a Saturday morning in front of a television. The car was the anchor for the emotion, which is why, decades later, seeing the car recreates the emotion. Film accelerated this process in ways that were almost engineered. The Fast and the Furious arrived in 2001. It is easy to underestimate what that film actually did. It did not just put Japanese sports cars on screen, it built a moral universe around them. The characters who drove these cars were loyal, skilled, and free. They lived outside the ordinary rules of adulthood. The cars were not status symbols in the traditional sense. They were not about wealth or class. They were about belonging to something, about being the kind of person who understood something other people did not. For a generation of teenagers watching that film in 2001, the message was clear and deeply felt. Certain cars meant a certain kind of life, and that life looked worth wanting.
The cultural timing matters enormously. Millennials encountered these influences at exactly the moment in adolescence when the brain begins constructing a future self. Neuroscientists call this process prospective memory consolidation, the brain rehearsing who it might become. When a teenager sees a film character achieve freedom, loyalty, and identity through a specific car, the brain does not simply enjoy the story, it files the car as a potential component of the future self. The car becomes part of the plan, not a conscious plan, a felt one.
Then adulthood arrived and took it away. The millennial economic experience is well documented at this point. Student debt, the 2008 financial collapse arriving just as the generation entered the workforce. A decade of stagnant wages during what should have been the most financially formative years of their lives. The future self that had been rehearsed in adolescence, the one with the Supra in the garage, kept getting deferred. Not abandoned, deferred. And deferred dreams do not weaken over time. Research in goal-persistent psychology suggests they often intensify. The longer a meaningful goal remains out of reach, the more psychological weight it accumulates. The car stopped being a car. It became evidence of a life that had been promised and not yet delivered. This is why the purchases, when they finally happen, carry an emotional charge completely disproportionate to the object. The man crying in the driveway when the keys are handed over is not crying about the car. He is crying about a version of himself that has finally been allowed to exist. He is closing a loop that opened when he was 9 years old, sitting cross-legged in front of a television, watching a machine do something that made him feel like the world was larger than he had been told. What gets misread as midlife crisis is actually something more precise. It is delayed identity completion. The psychological task that was interrupted, the construction of a self that included this object, this feeling, this possibility, is being resumed. Psychologist Dan McAdams has spent decades studying how humans construct personal narratives. His research consistently shows that people need narrative coherence. They need the story of their life to feel continuous and complete. When a significant chapter was left unfinished, the psyche keeps returning to it. Buying the childhood dream car is an act of narrative repair. There is also a generational dimension that tends to go unexamined. Millennials grew up in the last era before digital life became total. The cars of the 1990s exist at a specific cultural threshold. They were complex enough to feel advanced, but analog enough to feel human. No screens in the dashboard, no over-assisted steering. The driver was still in real contact with the machine. For a generation now living almost entirely through interfaces, the idea of sitting in a car built before all of that, a car that vibrates and requires attention and responds to input in immediate physical ways, is not just nostalgic, it is corrective. It is a return to a kind of reality that digital life has made scarce. The automotive industry built these cars without knowing what they were actually making. They were making emotional anchors for an entire generation. They were building objects that would sit inside the developing minds of millions of children and wait, patiently, for 30 decades. The man in the parking lot is not being irrational. He's being exactly as rational as a person can be when trying to recover something real. The car is not the point. The car is just the only remaining door back to a version of himself that was formed before the world told him what he could and could not have. He is not chasing a vehicle. He is trying to finish growing up.